Good morning. Today is July 25, 2003. I'm Ted Gunderson, former FBI agent. I entered on duty in 1951, retired March 1979. At the time of my retirement, I was in charge of the FBI Los Angeles Division, which was responsible for most of Southern California. I had over 700 personnel under my command and a budget of $22 million. Shortly after I retired, I was asked to investigate, as a private investigator, the Dr. Jeffrey R. McDonald case. It was after that, the investigation of this case, that I realized some of the serious situations that confronted our nation today. Within 10 months of entering the case, I obtained a signed confession from one of the assailants. Dr. McDonald had been convicted of the crime. It involved the murder of his wife, pregnant, and two children, 2.5 and 5.5 years old. The courts refused to accept my confession. The girl's name was Helena Stokely, saying that she was not credible. However, in researching the matter further, I learned that Helena had been an informant for the government and also for the local Fayetteville, North Carolina Police Department. So, in other words, she was not credible in connection with the McDonald case, but she was credible enough before this to work with various government sources. Helena told me that that night was her initiation into a satanic cult. This cult was involved in distributing drugs up and down the East Coast, drugs that were being flown in from Southeast Asia in military and planes. The operation was by the certain Army personnel and also CIA. She told me that there were generals involved in the drug operation, there were police officers, and at least 2 attorneys in the Fayetteville, North Carolina area. As a result of receiving this information, I went public. And from going public on talk shows, TV shows, and so forth, people from throughout the country came to me with the same basic stories. People from the East Coast and the West Coast, South, Midwest, and Northwest. It was then that I realized these people who did not know each other were furnishing the same basic information about satanic cults. And of course, as a result of this, I delved further into this situation. The path that this led me down is mind-boggling. Over the last 23, 24 years, I have developed so much information about the situation as it exists in our great country and gone public with it as much as possible, and yet I am being ignored. And the information I have furnished to authorities is being ignored. And I'll go into that later on in this interview. But the point in question here is, this is when the lights went on for me. Now, in looking through the situation, and as a result of my research, of course, I knew that we were advised about Pearl Harbor several days before the attack on Pearl Harbor, yet it was supposed to be a surprise attack. I talked to the naval intelligence officer who received the message in Washington, D.C. on December the 4th, 1941, that the Japanese were going to attack Pearl Harbor. He sent the message on to his superiors. After the war, he was subpoenaed before a committee, congressional committee. He was told by his superiors at that time, ignore the subpoena. You don't understand now, but you will later on. As we all know, and as well documented, we knew in advance of Pearl Harbor. It was covered up. And then you have the Jack Kennedy assassination. There was more than one shooter involved in the Kennedy assassination. Lee Harvey Oswald was a pawn. It was a combination of the CIA and the Chicago mob, Sam Giancana. This is very well documented in a TV series that's appeared on A&E about every 6 months, as a matter of fact. It's called The Men Who Killed Kennedy by Nigel Turner, an English producer. And then we had Bobby Kennedy assassination. Bobby Kennedy's assassination, there were more bullet holes in the walls and the doors than Saran Saran's gun could hold. There were more people involved in that, another cover-up. And then we had the most notary of all after that, subsequent, was Ruby Ridge. Randy Weaver refused to be an informant for the government. He was set up, and he had refused to appear in the courts. And as a result, we had the Ruby Ridge fiasco, where an FBI sharpshooter killed his wife while holding the baby, another cover-up. And then we had Waco. Waco was an unbelievable situation because the military was there, took on the Koresh and his followers, and that's in direct violation of Posse Comitatus, whereby the military is not allowed to become involved in the enforcement of civilian population. Of course, the FBI was there also, and BATF was also there. There were four BATF officers who were shot, and the Koresh people were blamed for the shooting. However, in researching that matter, I have learned that all four BATF agents took a shot to the head. Now, this means that there was a sharpshooter there, and in one instance, the bullet came from above into the man's lip and down into his body. That was just one. In further research in the matter, I learned that these four BATF agents had at one time been a bodyguard for Bill Clinton, the President of the United States. And next we had the World Trade Center bombing in February 1993. Unfortunately, there were 6 people killed. But what happened there was the FBI had an informant, Salam, a 43-year-old former Egyptian army officer, and he wore a body mic when he went in on his contacts with the terrorists. And as a result, they had an open and closed case at the trial. However, he testified at the trial that he also wore a body mark when he was interviewed by the FBI agents. And at that time, he said that, hey, I've been commissioned to put the bomb together by the terrorists. We're going to use a dummy bomb, aren't we? His superiors in the FBI said, no, we're going to use a real bomb. The point being, the FBI not only knew in advance of the bombing of the World Trade Center in February 1993, the FBI furnished the ingredients for the bomb. Documentation, a New York Times article, October 23, 1993. But then we had Oklahoma City. And in Oklahoma City, which occurred in 1995, they claimed that Tim McVeigh and Nichols were involved. I personally made 2 trips to Oklahoma City out of my pocket and investigated the case. I have a 220-some page report that's available to the public concerning this situation. And I was told by an inside investigator that there were at least 11 other people involved in Oklahoma City. And then after Oklahoma City, we had the World Trade Center. Of course, September 11th, 2001. And it's been well documented through numerous sources, and I'll go into that more in detail in a few minutes, that there was much more to this than we've been told by the mainstream media. And as a matter of fact, if you look at those last 3 cover-ups, World Trade Center, February 93, Oklahoma City, and World Trade Center 2001, you will note that there's a Middle East connection in all 3 of them. Now, after the Jeffrey McDonald case, I was involved in a number of other investigations, which I have learned have also been covered up by authorities who are responsible for investigating these matters. In addition to the Jeffrey McDonald case, I investigated a case on the West Coast, Manhattan Beach, California, called the McMartin trial, McMartin preschool case. The children said that after they were dropped off by their parents in the morning, the authorities, the teachers, in a number of instances, took them down through tunnels and up into a trapdoor of the triplex next door, placed them in automobiles, took these 2, 3, 4-year-old children out into the community where they were prostituted. The authorities again claimed that this is not true. The children were exaggerating. They were influenced by their therapists. Well, in 1990, I had an opportunity to gain control of the McMartin school property. I hired along with some of the parents, of course, I hired an archaeologist, Dr. Gary Stickler from UCLA, and we began an excavation of the property. The authorities had looked for tunnels under the school in 1987, said there were none, they could find none. Well, Dr. Gary Stickler, after 34 days, specifically stated that there were definitely tunnels there. He came up with this conclusion in the middle of the second trial of Ray Buckey. We called the district attorney's office. He sent an investigator named Perez out who argued with Dr. Stickler that there were no tunnels in the school. The authorities ignored the fact that we did find these tunnels. In other words, the children, in my opinion, were telling the truth. At least they were telling the truth about the tunnels. Now, other activity that the children claimed they were involved in or were exposed to were adults in robes chanting with candles. They talked about the burning and the sacrifice and the murder of babies in ceremonies, obviously a satanic ceremony. This is just a touch of what I've been involved in. I might also mention that in the late 1980s, I was actively involved in what's called the Franklin cover-up. This is a case where children were flown from Sioux City, Iowa to Washington, D.C. for sex orgies with congressmen, senators, and it goes all the way, at that time, up to the White House. And this case, again, was covered up. I've written letters to the Attorney General of the United States, to the Attorney General of the state of Nebraska, and documented this. And as a matter of fact, I have a report that contains details concerning this case, and it ties into an organization in Washington, D.C. known as the Finders. This is my report on the Finders. And this not only is documented out of my investigation with former State Senator John DeCamp, it's documented through U.S. Customs. In 1987, the Tallahassee Police Department received a phone call anonymously from an individual who said that there were 2 well-dressed men and a number of children in the park. The police went down, arrested the man, looked at the children. The children didn't even know how to use toilets or telephones. They traced the case to Washington, D.C., to the Finders. And in researching this, and as a result of the information furnished by the U.S. Customs agent, in fact, I have the U.S. Customs agent report here, it was noted that the Finders, an organization established in the early 1960s, was involved in kidnapping children. And I have the last paragraph of the last page of the Customs report in front of me, and let me just read this portion to you. This Customs agent arrived at the scene of the Finders on April the 2nd, 1987. And he was told by the Metropolitan Police officers who had conducted searches there through search warrants that the circumstances which indicated that the investigation into the activity of the Finders had become an internal CIA matter. The Metropolitan Police report has been classified secret and was not available for review. I was advised, this is the Customs agent, that the FBI had withdrawn from the investigation several weeks prior, and that the FBI Foreign Counterintelligence Division, that's Division 5, had directed the Metropolitan Police Department not to advise the FBI Washington Field Office of anything that had transpired. The Washington Field Office is the investigative branch of the FBI in the Washington, D.C. area. So this was not only withheld from the public, it was also withheld from their own agents within the organization. The kidnappings of children, the missing children in this country, is a very serious matter. I have in front of me a July 1982 Reader's Digest article about missing children. And this article states that 100,000 children disappear every year and are never heard from again in the United States. Now, we're not talking about runaway teenagers. We're talking about 2, 3, 4-year-old children. I have personally made formal complaints to the FBI on this case on 6 occasions and been ignored. By the way, let me also show you a headline in the Washington Times, which is dated June 29, 1989. And this headline points out the homosexual probe ensnarls officials of Bush and Reagan. What better documentation do you need? Again, I have been ignored. And it's inconceivable that a person with my credibility, a person who was at one time was one of the top executives in the FBI, would file a complaint with the FBI and be ignored. So we have a cover-up in Pearl Harbor, Jack Kennedy, Bobby Kennedy, Ruby Ridge, Waco, World Trade Center 93, Oklahoma City 95. We have 9/11 in 2001. And then I personally go out in the interim and during that same period and develop information about criminal activity that's taking place in this country, and I am ignored. Well, in order to understand the situation, let me tell you a little about Promise Software. Promise Software was a computer that was developed by Bill and Nancy Hamilton out of Washington, D.C. It was able to gather together and contain information, compile information concerning law enforcement, the court procedures, the judge activities, of course, as far as the courts were concerned, and other activity at various levels, all levels, basically. What it was an intelligence gathering device, and the Department of Justice leased this from the Hamiltons for 2 years. At the end of 2 years, they refused to pay the Hamiltons the $10 million that they owed to the Hamiltons. The Hamiltons went into court, bankruptcy court, filed a lawsuit. They won in court, but the court said, you're in the wrong court, you need to go to the district court. And of course, they had spent over $1 million at that point and couldn't continue to carry the case out at another level. Now, after the Department of Justice refused to pay the Hamiltons, they gave the Reagan administration, through former Attorney General Meese, gave the Promise Software to a fellow named Earl Bryant. Earl Bryant's former owner of the United Press International. Bryant then took this computer, Promise Software, sold it to the Canadians, the English, the French, and the Israelis. And what the British, Canadians, French, and the Israelis didn't know at the time was that we had put a trap door in that computer, so all the information, intelligence information that those countries gathered was also available to us, unknown to those countries, of course. The person who put that trap door together was an individual named Michael Riconosciuto. Michael was an intelligence agent for a number of years, and the Brooks Committee in the 1980s, around 1990 actually, late 1980s, early 1990s, had a hearing. Michael was contacted and asked to testify about his involvement in installing the trapdoor into this computer. And he received a phone call, according to Michael, from a fellow named Vietnix with the Department of Justice. Vietnix told him, if you testify before Congress, you will be sorry. Michael refused, ignored the warning, and testified. 6 weeks later, he was arrested for drugs, tried, and sentenced to 30 years. Michael claims he was set up on the drug arrest. I am inclined to believe that's true. This is a first offense, drug offense. You get 30 years. Michael's only mistake there was that he was testified and told the truth. I have been Michael's investigator of record for 20-some years. I met Michael in 1982. And for a year and a half prior to 9/11, I attempted to get in and see Michael in prison. I was not allowed into prison to visit him at that time, at any time during that period. I was finally able to gain access to Michael in January of 2003. And as a matter of fact, I spent 3 days with Michael, January 3rd, 4th, and 5th. And Michael gave me information, and the reason he'd been trying to get to me and give me this information about his involvement, or his development, actually the development, not involvement, the development of information concerning a terrorist activity in America. Michael told me at that time that in January, February 2001, he, through his sources, had gained information that there would be terrorist attacks in the United States by the Arabs. Now, you have to understand, the question arises, how could Michael develop this information while he's in prison? Well, in the spring of 1986, I was contacted by a high-level official in the Reagan administration, asked if I could help the Afghan rebels in their fight against the Soviets. I contacted Michael, knowing Michael's contacts within the community, intelligence community, and his knowledge of weapons. And Michael and I met with an individual from the State Department / CIA, and there was a fourth person there, Tim Osman. We later learned that Tim Osman was Osama bin Laden. As a result of that meeting, I actually didn't do much. I just introduced the parties, and then I dropped out of the picture. But as a result of that meeting, Michael continued and ended up furnishing the surface-to-air missiles to the Afghan rebels that defeated the communist Soviets. Now, you have to understand this also. This was a patriotic move by me because we were fighting the communists. Bin Laden was our ally, our friend at that time. So that's how Michael developed this information. Now, Michael told me in my prison visit with him in January that he made every effort to contact authorities, was unsuccessful, and finally his attorney in Chicago was able to write a letter to Colin Powell. He told Colin Powell, Secretary of State, that Michael, he didn't use the name Michael, he said one of his clients, had information about a forthcoming terrorist attacks. And it was subsequent to that that Michael was interviewed in March of 2001 by an FBI agent. I might also mention that this attorney in Chicago furnished this information to the U.S. attorney and to the FBI in Chicago and had meetings with FBI agents there. So Michael was interviewed by the FBI in March of 2001, and at that time he told the FBI, Agent Kutry, resident agent out of the Williamsport, Pennsylvania resident agency, that he had information, and he furnished the identification of the American, so-called American, but actually was Arab, in New Jersey, who was coordinating forthcoming terrorist attacks on the United States. I'm reading from the report that I did, by the way. Had information on the movement of Soviet-made shoulder-fired missiles into the United States, was coordinating forthcoming skyjackings, was coordinating bombings and espionage, knew the identity of sleepers in the United States and overseas. Michael also told the FBI agent that he had information about 37 Soviet missiles that were to be smuggled into the United States from Bulgaria to Colombia to Canada and then to through a Canadian air firm into the United States. And he told the FBI that there was a 30-hour window when we could have grabbed these missiles. So Michael thought he had done his patriotic duty, furnishing this information to the FBI. And on September the 11th, 2001, he was quite shocked and surprised at the occurrence of 9/11. On September the 13th, 2001, he was visited again by Special Agent Kutry of the FBI, and there was another unidentified agent with him. And at that time, here's what Kutry said to Reconnaissado. He wanted to know why Reconnaissado was bothering the FBI and wasting its time. He accused Reconnaissado of seeking publicity, accused Reconnaissado of being anti-FBI and anti-government, called Reconnaissado a conspiracy theorist, called Reconnaissado a know-it-all, called Reconnaissado a hoaxer, and threatened him with prosecution. Now that isn't all. Let me mention this, that shortly after I sent a letter to Senator George Allen of Virginia And in this letter, I asked the senator to communicate with the FBI and determine the exact date that Michael was interviewed in March 2001. We wanted to verify, and we wanted the FBI itself to confirm that they'd interviewed Michael, right, for documentation. Shortly after I sent this letter to the senator, 4 of Michael's friends who had been in communication with Michael while he was in prison and were not knowledgeable, professionally knowledgeable about terrorism, were contacted by the FBI. The FBI, without search warrants, seized their computers, and they demanded all letters, documents, correspondence, books, and so forth, and also inquired about the Arabs' contacts of Reconocido. Those people said that they were more interested in the Arab contacts than they were in any information that Michael had given to them. This information that I'm giving to you is, by the way, is documented, well documented, in Michael's personal letters, in his handwritings. Here's one of his letters. I'll hold this up for you. This is an example. Okay, that's Michael's handwriting. And here is the one of the letters he wrote to his attorney. And the date stamp on this is February the 6th, 2001. You can see it right up here in the corner. So this information is well documented, and as well as establishing through the date stamps, postal stamps, that it is a timely information. I took this report that I compiled as a result of my work with Michael and contacts with Michael. I was in Washington, D.C. for 3 weeks, and I disseminated this report to every committee on the Hill, to 155 congressmen, senators, and also to Mr. Lee Hamilton, who is co-chairman of the President's Commission to investigate 9/11. I also had a personal telephone conversation with Mr. Lee Hamilton, and at that time I said, and this, I sent this January 29, 2003, I said, Michael has considerably more information about terrorist activity than is in my report. For example, he claims to have details concerning the anthrax letters to the Congress. This is my communication to the senator. I was in Washington. I did not have access to a typewriter, so I wrote it in longhand. I also sent a letter to Senator Leahy, New Hampshire, and I gave him the same basic information. And I told him Michael had other information on the 9/11 attack, and he also knows the identity of the person who has the anthrax letters. Here's my letter or communication to the senator. Okay. And then I took my report and I disseminated it to the U.S. Attorney General of the United States, to Mr. Glenn Fine, Inspector General, U.S. Department of Justice, Tom Ridge, Homeland Security, Roscoe Howard, U.S. Attorney, Washington, D.C., John Keeney, Criminal Division, Department of Justice, John Roberts, Office of Professional Responsibility, Department of Justice, Rob Davis, Office of Intelligence and Policy, Department of Justice, Donald Rumsfeld, Secretary of Defense, the Joint Chiefs of Staff in the Pentagon, Colin Powell, State Department, Intelligence and Research, State Department, CIA, Washington, D.C., Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board, State Department, Kenneth Melson, U.S. Attorney, Northern District of Virginia, the National Security Agency, State Department also, and National Security Advisor, excuse me, with the State Department, National Security Council, NSC, the White House, that's the intelligence branch of the President, by the way, Paul McNulty, U.S. Attorney, Alexandria, Virginia, Tommy Thompson, Secretary of Health, and so forth. I took my report also, and I contacted the Washington Post, the New York Times, and the LA Times. I call them the Three Sisters. And I gave them a copy of the report, and I followed up with a telephone conversation, and I then I learned that they were not going to print the story. I also gave the report to the Associated Press in St. Paul, Minnesota. And this is, I contacted the reporter who has been in touch with Colleen Raleigh, the FBI agent who tried to get a search warrant on Missouri and was turned down. And his name is Patrick Howe. And I called him 10 days later, and I said, "Are you going to report my story?" And he said, "No." And I said, "Why?" He said, "Because it's too big. It's too big to report." I can't believe it. As a result of I'll say, stirring up the pot, which is what I did, of course, we finally received a letter back from the FBI, and this is dated May 22, 2003. And it is signed by Mr. Larry Mefford, M-E-F-F-O-R-D. And in this letter, Mr. Mefford says, "Mr. Reconnaissance has contacted the FBI on numerous occasions alleging he has information regarding terrorist-related activity that would be of interest to the FBI. On each occasion, the FBI has made every effort to accommodate Mr. Reconnaissance and investigate his allegations." Now, hey, wait a minute. Mr. Kutry told Reconnaissance when he talked to him September 13th that they did not investigate the allegations as made by Michael Reconnaissance because they didn't think he was telling the truth. But now they're saying that they did investigate it. However, at no time has he provided any credible evidence or indication of a federal violation within the investigative jurisdiction of the FBI. Now are they saying that terrorism is not a violation of the FBI within their jurisdiction? Continuing, I won't read the whole letter, but in this letter we finally were able to document that, as a matter of fact, the FBI admits they interviewed Michael on March the 20th, 2001. And in this letter, the Assistant Director, Mefford, states that on March 20, 2001, an FBI representative interviewed Mr. Reconnaissance at the Allenwood Federal Correction Institute concerning his allegations, and appropriate steps were taken to investigate his concerns. They were not only his concerns, they were our concerns, the whole country's concerns. However, there was no indication of any violation of federal law within our investigative jurisdiction. Did you listen to the report, my report of what Michael told me and told the FBI? And now they're saying there's no indication of any violation of federal law within our jurisdiction? Continuing over on the next page, Mr. Reconnaissance was not deemed to be a credible source of information concerning the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001. Also, in conclusion, excuse me, in view of the FBI's documented efforts to accommodate Mr. Reconnaissance and complete lack of credibility information he has provided, in addition to the numerous FBI sources that have been spent investigating Reconnaissance's allegations, no additional contacts will be made with him. In the event Mr. Reconnaissance has information he would like to provide to the FBI, he may do so by sending it to the nearest FBI field office. I hope this information is helpful in responding to your constituent. I am returning your enclosures as requested. Now, Michael Reconnaissance, let me get this straight. He furnished information about forthcoming terrorist activity. He said he furnished the names of the person in the United States who was behind this movement. He said he had other information, by the way, but he did not want to provide this additional details until he was granted immunity. And the FBI never bothered to come back and talk to him about the additional information he had. They never attempted to give him any immunity. They never wrote to anybody in the authority in an effort to obtain immunity for Michael and then follow up with this information. Michael gave them this information in March 20th. The incident occurred on September the 11th, and he has no credibility. Unbelievable. I have in front of me a article dated June 27, Boston Globe, Boston, Massachusetts. And in this article, Mr. Mefford testifies before Congress. And here's what he says. The FBI is conducting investigations into Al-Qaeda and affiliated terrorist groups in 40 states, placing urgency on finding any sleeper cells that could mount any large-scale attacks, a senior official said yesterday. Larry Mefford, Assistant Director of the FBI's Counterintelligence Division, said after appearing before the Senate Judiciary Committee panel on terrorism that the investigations range from the people identified as Al-Qaeda operatives to uncorroborated tips from citizens. He goes on and stated before Congress, the network remains the most serious threat to U.S. interests both at home and overseas. Mefford told the panel that network includes groups committed to the international jihad movement, and it has demonstrated the ability to survive attacks. In the United States, the FBI worries most about it has not definitely located members of al-Qaeda cells who might be able to pull off an attack like the 19 hijackers who flew planes into buildings on September the 11th, 2001. I want to also mention that Michael told the FBI, Mr. Kutry, in March of '01, that his source in New Jersey had information about sleepers around the country, and Michael had the information about the identity of 30 skyjackers who were going to be involved in this attack. There were to have been 6 skyjackings, not 4. The other 2 planes did not take off, apparently because FAA grounded the airplanes after the first 4 were in flight. And Michael said he had the knowledge about not only their true identity, but also the false identification that they were using. As a result of my attempts to arouse Congress, the Senate, and to pass out several hundred of this report, copies of this report to various official agencies, I received a couple of responses. One senator from Nevada, Senator Harry Reid, said, "Thank you very much. By the way, check my website. You'll see what I stand for. Mother, apple pie, Chevrolet, and hot dogs." I had another letter from a congressman who referred the matter to Senator Boxer. Boxer had already received a copy of my report, as did Senator Feinstein. And then I had a letter from the U.S. Attorney Central District of California, who said that it's not within his jurisdiction. The matter should be referred to the U.S. Attorney in Las Vegas, Nevada. This is a matter that should be referred to the Department of Justice, Washington, D.C., and it was referred to the Department of Justice, Washington, D.C. Now, later, after I disseminated all these reports in Washington, D.C., I sent a separate letter to President Bush. And what I said in my letter there was, hey, I've been harassed, and as a matter of fact, I found an individual in the basement of the complex where I stay in Los Angeles, and I ran him out of there. He was a biker type with bandana, headband, a leather jacket, chains down to the floor, to the ground. And it was after I ran him out of there, that I realized, this was in April, by the way, and I made a police report on this, and I wrote a letter to the president, and I pointed this out to him, that I'm being harassed, and I assume I'm being harassed and followed because of my activity in this regard, meaning 911 and my contact with Michael Riconosciuto. I received a letter back, and by the way, I also attached my intelligence 911 report to the president, and here's the letter I received back. So the president's aware of this. At least one of his aides is. I don't know the extent of that if it got to his desk or not, but it should have, something of this seriousness. And there's the president's letter response to me acknowledging this. Further reviewing the matter, I obtained a copy of the final report, December 10, 2002, joint inquiry by the Congress, findings and conclusions. And this is, I won't read the whole report, it's too lengthy, but here's a couple of excerpts that I'll read to you. While the intelligence community has amassed a great deal of valuable intelligence information regarding Osama bin Laden and his terrorist activities, none of it identified the time, place, and specific nature of the attacks that were planned for September 11, 2001. Continuing, another paragraph. It was the general view of the intelligence community in the spring and summer of 2001 that the threatened bin Laden attacks would most likely occur against U.S. interests overseas, despite indications of plans to attack in the domestic United States. Another paragraph. During 1999, the National Security Agency obtained a number of communications, none of which included specific detail regarding the time, place, or nature of the September 11 attacks, connecting individuals to terrorism who were identified after September 11, 2001 as participants in the attacks that occurred on that day. So, did anybody bother to check and interview Michael Riconosciuto? No. They did interview him. They did nothing with the information. Now, going back to September 11, 2001, I have in front of me a report that it reflects an interview on October 28, 2001 by Mr. Dan Rather. He is a CBS News anchor, and he was interviewing a fellow named Tom Kennedy, a member of the Federal Emergency Management. And during the interview, Mr. Kennedy let slip a frightening truth. FEMA sent the urban search and rescue teams to New York City on, hey, wait a minute, Monday night. Monday night was September the 10th, not September the 11th. In connection with 911, a firefighter on the 76th floor and another one on the 84th floor radioed down before its collapse that the steel was not melting, but bombs were going off. It's also interesting to note that on CBS News, September the 26th, 2001, it was reported that put options were 90 times above the normal from September the 6th through the 10th of 2001 on United Airlines stock, and it was 285 times higher on Thursday before the attack. On American Airlines stock, on September the 10th, the day before 2001, American Airlines put options were 60 times above the normal. It's also interesting to note that Le Figaro, a French newspaper, reported that the CIA met with bin Laden in July of 2001, just a month before the attacks, and the conferences took place from July 4th until July 14th. Now, again, going back to Michael Riconosciuto, how would he develop this information while he's in prison? He developed it through his contacts in the Muslim world after he met with bin Laden in the spring of 1986. Okay, number one. Number two, he had access to a computer at one time when he was in the federal system. And also, he has ways of developing information and receiving information in the prison which are unknown to the authorities. There are some good FBI agents out there. I don't want to put down the FBI with a brush. No, there's some real good FBI agents out there. They're very dedicated and they're loyal Americans. I want to make that very clear. One is Colleen Rowley. She was the FBI Minneapolis legal attorney who attempted to obtain a search warrant on Missouri, who was one of the terrorists, and she was thwarted in her attempts. They refused to give her a search warrant. She claims that she feels that had she obtained this search warrant, she could have developed more information concerning the terrorist attacks. Now, I mentioned there were 30 terrorists. Actually, the other two planes that did not get off the ground, according to Michael, the targets were the Statue of Liberty and the Capitol building. Then we have Keith Williams, FBI agent in Phoenix FBI office, who said that he developed information about the terrorists taking flight trainings, and they weren't interested in landing or taking off, but merely in flying the plane once it was in the air. And then we have an interview by ABC again, and this is an interview by Brian Ross and Vic Walter, December the 19th, 2002. And in this interview, FBI agent Robert Wright, and John Vinson said they were called off criminal investigations of suspected terrorists tied to the deadly bombings of the 2 U.S. embassies in Africa. U.S. officials say Al-Qaeda was responsible for the embassy attacks and the September 11, 2001 attacks in the United States. This is a quote. September the 11th is a direct result of the incompetence of the FBI's International Terrorism Unit. No doubt about that. Absolutely no doubt about that, Wright said. I can't think of the things I know and not go public. Continuing, Wright said that he passed he pressed for information and authorization to open a criminal investigation into the money trail of this group, and his supervisors stopped him. Here's a quote from that interview. The supervisor who was there from headquarters was right straight across from me and started yelling at me, "You will not open criminal investigations. I forbid any of you. You will not open criminal investigations against any of these intelligence subjects," Wright said. Even though they were on a terrorist task force and said they had proof of criminal activity, Wright said he was told not to pursue the matter. I followed up with this matter, and I contacted the assistant U.S. attorney who was working with Mr. Wright and also Mr. Vincent. His name is Mark Flessner, F-L-E-S-S-N-E-R. I gave Mr. Flessner a copy of my 911 report interview with Riconosciuto. And he was also interviewed on this ABC show. Did I say ABC? Yes, ABC show. And he said that here's a quote from him, by the way, on the show. "There were powers bigger than I was in the Justice Department and within the FBI that simply were not going to let the building of a criminal case, happen, and it didn't happen," Flessner said. Now, to make things worse, Wright testified that he was floored by Abdul Hafiz's, H-A-F-I-Z-S, refusal, an FBI agent, by the way, who refused to conduct a telephone tap against other Arabs and Muslims. And he was floored by this, and he immediately called FBI headquarters. Their reaction surprised him even more. The supervisor from headquarters says, quote, "Well, you have to understand where he's coming from, Bob." I said, "No, no, 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 no. I understand where I'm coming from," said Wright. "We both took the same damn oath to defend the country against all enemies, foreign and domestic." And he just said, "No, no way in hell." This is a quote again from him. So what made him really more uneasy was the fact that Abdel, far from being reprimanded, was promoted to one of the FBI's most important anti-terrorist posts, the American Embassy in Saudi Arabia, to handle investigations for the FBI in that Muslim country. So what's happening in America today, folks? Well, let me tell you what I think is happening. The anti-terrorism legislation was initially written under the George Bush Sr. administration in the 1980s. A female Department of Justice attorney made the statement publicly, "Before this legislation passes, people will have to be killed." Fast forward to February 1993. We have the car bomb, okay? 6 people were killed, right? Not enough. There was $500,000 in damage and 1,000 people injured. However, fast forward to April 1995. Oklahoma City, 168 people, maybe 169 killed. Within a year after that, the anti-terrorism legislation, which was authored under the George Bush Sr. administration, passed. But it wasn't tough enough. So we had to have another terrorist attack, right? September 11, 2001, we had the attack on the World Trade Center. By the way, here's the New York Times article for the car bomb situation that states, by the way, Yosef, the leader of the terrorist group, was CIA trained, and this article states that the FBI knew in advance of the bombing, car bombing of the World Trade Center in February '93, did nothing, actually provided the bomb, the ingredients for the bomb, which was used in connection with that car bombing. So what do we have now? Now we have Homeland Security that takes over all law enforcement, local, state, and federal, in the event of an emergency situation. It has the authority to take over private businesses, child protective services. They want 1 in every 10 Americans to be a snitch or an informant for the government. Children will be trained in terrorism. They already have FEMA camps set up for this. And then they have Operation Garden Plot. That's an article. That's a book that was written in 1993 by the Air Force as to how to handle the civilians who are interned under certain circumstances. And now we're talking about national identification cards. In control of all the money you earn and spend, includes money in the grocery store, of course. Microchips to locate children by satellite. New cars will have tracking devices. And Primakov, a former KGB agent, will be and has been assigned as an advisor to Homeland Security. Don't you find this very interesting? And then we had Patriot Act number 1, and this is H.R. 3261. Under certain circumstances, Americans will not be able to face their peers in a trial. You will not be given an attorney. You can be held without bond. Librarians can be prosecuted if they don't report the issuance of certain books that are lent out to people who are come into the library. Search warrants searches without search warrants. They can jail Americans without trial. They can jail without being charged. Americans can jail without being charged. Recently, there was a rumor that Patriot Act 2 had been written within the Department of Justice. The Department of Justice denied it. However, the act was disseminated secretly. It's an 87-page document. For more information on Patriot Act 2, look up www.publicintegrity.org under What Bush Knew, in quotes. That's www.publicintegrity.org, quote, What Bush Knew. And this is the act, the coup d'etat, really. Because if this act ever passes, anybody who is against the war, you can demonstrate, yes, but you will be arrested. And you will have to be very cautious as to what you say, even on the telephone, because there's no question about it, many of our telephones are tapped, including mine. So, we also have the development. This is in the Las Vegas Review-Journal, February the 13th, 2003. It talks about the total information awareness operation in this country today. And they will be gathering information such as private data on credit card records, bank transactions, car rental receipts, gun purchases, along with the quantities of intelligence information. You have the headlines there. Las Vegas Review-Journal. And here is the article at the bottom of the page. Government plans to identify terrorist suspects. This can be used against you as citizens. And I have here also Las Vegas Review-Journal, May the 10th, 2003, wireless 911 system costly but saves life. They talk here about equipment that can pinpoint the location of a 911 cell phone when somebody dials 911. And they talk about suburban county installed computer software that can tell dispatchers almost exactly where a wireless call originates. They've been able to trace calls from landline phones since the 1980s, but only a few hundred of the nearly 7,000 centers nationwide have the enhanced system that can do the same with wireless units. This is the article. This can be used against you. They say it can be used against terrorists, it can be used against you, and it will be if we don't put a stop to what's going on in America today. And here is an article in the New York Times captioned, "You are a suspect." And they're talking about the Homeland Security. Every purchase you make with a credit card, every magazine subscription you buy and medical prescription you fill, every website you visit, an email you send or receive, every academic grade you receive, every bank deposit you make, every trip you book, and every event you attend will be recorded, or can be recorded. They go on and they talk about recording of applications for passports, driver's license, bridge toll records, judicial and divorce records, complaints from noisy neighbors to the FBI. This is, folks, it's here. It's alive and well. And here's another article from the New York Times, A Snooper's Dream. And this is dated November 18, 2002. They talk again about total information awareness. It's a project of the Defense Advanced Research Project Agency. It's called DARPA, which helps develop the internet and host of cutting-edge military technologies. It is run by John Poindexter, the retired Navy Rear Admiral, who was Ronald Reagan's national security advisor, and in that capacity helped devise a plan to sell arms to Iran and illegally divert the proceeds to the rebels in Nicaragua. All transactions of everyday life, credit card purchases, travel, and telephone records, even internet traffic, email, will be available to them. And this is one that's really scary. This was in the Philadelphia Inquirer, and it's July the 2nd, 2003, a very recent article. I'll just read a couple of lines from this. The Pentagon is developing an urban surveillance system that would use computers and thousands of cameras to track, record, and analyze the movement of every vehicle in a foreign city. Don't think they won't use it in our country, too, by the way, folks. Police, scientists, and privacy experts say the unclassified technology could easily be adapted to spy on Americans. The project centerpiece is groundbreaking software that can automatically identify vehicles by size, color, shape, and license tag, or drivers and passengers by face. The project is being overseen by DARPA, Defense Advanced Research Project Agency, and is creating a computerized diary that records and analyzes everything a person says, sees, hears, reads, or touches. Continuing, U.S. police use cameras to monitor bridges, tunnels, airports, and border crossings, and regularly access security cameras in banks, stores, and garages for investigative leads. Philadelphia Inquirer, July 2, 2003. Now, why and how does this happen? We have Congress passing these laws that take away many of our constitutional rights and civil liberties. Earlier in my interview, I mentioned the Franklin cover-up. Well, this is a case involving the use of children for sex by high-level politicians in Washington, D.C., and also the kidnapping of children. It involves satanic cults. It involves 18 mysterious murders or deaths, actually mysterious deaths, but many of them were murders. Cover. They bought up this tape, and it is available, by the way, through my website, tedgunderson.com, small letters, tedgunderson.com, as is the Finder's Report, which I mentioned a few moments ago. So the show did not air, but it was listed in the TV Guide. I recently wrote off to TV Guide and asked for a copy of the TV Guide for May the 3rd, 1994. Here's a copy of that I received in return. You'll see here, right here, that Conspiracy of Silence, which is the video, is not listed, although it was listed originally. And in its place, we have a show called Balance of Nature, the Diminishing Lynx Population, featured a comparison of a wild lynx with a captive one. Well, I wasn't going to be outfoxed by the mainstream media, so what did I do? Well, I went down to the LA Times personally, and I pulled the TV log for May the 3rd, 1994. And here's the TV log for May the 3rd, 1994. You see it right there. Conspiracy of Silence is listed. Well, maybe it was listed on the West Coast and not on the East Coast. So I then went to the Philadelphia Inquirer. And TV log Philadelphia Inquirer is listed also. Conspiracy of Silence. Mainstream media, the control that they have over us. And this is the reason we are not being told, actually, what's happening in America today. In a poll, a recent poll in Europe, this was reported by Time Magazine 2002, there were 250,000 Europeans who were asked what nation poses the greatest threat to world peace. 7.8% of the Europeans polled said North Korea. 8.9% said Iraq, and 83.3% said the United States. So what's happened to the great FBI? I'm proud to say that I served 21 years under J. Edgar Hoover. J. Edgar Hoover was a man of integrity. He was honest. He was dedicated. He served for 48 years, from 1924 until he died in May of 1972. During that period, we did not have one instance of corruption, not one instance of corruption within the ranks. I recently saw a TV documentary about the FBI, and it was pointed out that J. Edgar Hoover was a rascal because he kept all those secret files on Congress in Washington, D.C., where he could blackmail them. Well, it's interesting, when we had those files, we didn't have these problems that we have today. Actually, let me explain about those files, because I was personally involved in them, and I have been there. I've reviewed some of those files. I reviewed Richard Nixon's file on one occasion, because I had to, because of a case that I had in headquarters. I was assigned to headquarters, by the way, for 5 years. I go out on a bank robbery. I interview John Smith. John Smith gives me the description of the bank robber, 5'10", 170. And after I obtained that information, John Smith says, by the way, Mr. Gunderson, let me mention that I have information that I think would be of interest to you. Congressman XYZ is frequenting a house of prostitution, and as a matter of fact, he paid the hooker, the prostitute, $100 in his personal check, with a personal check, after he was serviced. Now, this actually happened, by the way, in Tennessee, back years ago. I happen to know about the case. It was a U.S. congressman. So here I am at a bank robbery. I write up my bank robbery report, but I had this other information, so I write a separate memo on the other information. I send it to Washington, D.C., personal attention of Mr. Hoover. Mr. Hoover puts it in the file. It's important, and I'll tell you why it's important. We never should have destroyed those files. It's important because if Congressman XYZ is considered for a federal judgeship, considered for an ambassadorship, we would then pull that information out and investigate it. We didn't investigate it at the time, but we did have the information. It was raw intelligence, true. It had to be confirmed. It had to be credible at a later date, possibly, if we were going to delve into the situation. So that's the use of those files. But he died in May of 1972. And then Congress said, well, we don't want another man to be in power for 40 years like J. Edgar Hoover was, because he has too much power, too mighty, too powerful. So we passed, Congress, we will pass a law that says no director will serve more than 10 years. And then Congress also said, members of Congress said, you know, we have to get rid of those Hooverite guys because they're loyal, they're good Americans, and they're dedicated. So we're going to put a mandatory retirement on the agents of age 55. I retired in March of 1979, 50 years of age. Now you know how old I am. And I had 5 more years to serve. I decided I'd get out then. Also, Attorney General Griffin Bell and later Attorney General Ben Civiletti under Carter asked me to coordinate security for the Pan American Games, so I retired early in order to coordinate the games in San Juan, Puerto Rico in the summer of 1979. So what they did with this law, they got rid of the loyal, dedicated Hooverites, true, but we did not have one instance of corruption during our tenure. The FBI had an impeccable record. We were admired and respected. And if we received a complaint on a case, whether we liked it or not, we investigated it. We had 164 categories which we investigated. And if it came in and fell within one of those 164 categories, we investigated it. We didn't put it in a wastebasket. We didn't throw it away. We didn't disregard it. Now what you have is what I call selective prosecution, and it takes on regularly. It occurs regularly. I know because I've been a victim of it. There were attempts in the early 1980s, by the way, to set me up on a fraud case. I did not commit fraud, so they were unsuccessful there, the FBI. They attempted to set me up on a drug case in 1982. I was successful there because I would never be involved in anything of that nature. And the person who was liaisoning with the FBI and trying to set me up was a girl named Pam Fawcett. After 6 months, she came to me and told me that she had the run of the FBI Modesto, California office. The FBI had given her $2,000. She even had her own coffee cup, and she could come and go as she pleased. But I helped her out on a couple of occasions because she had a young son, a young teenage son, 14 years old as I recall, who had some problems, and I gave her some fatherly advice. She didn't have a husband or a boyfriend. And when she came to me, she drove to Los Angeles. We met in the parking lot, and she told me the story how she was set up on drugs, and they told her that if you want to get out of this charge, these drug charges, you have to work with us against Ted Gunderson. And she said also that she gave me the notes of one of the telephone conversations we had where the agent wrote out the instructions on what she should ask of me on the telephone. I have these notes, by the way, in a safety deposit box. That's how I knew she was telling the truth. So I said to Pam, I said, well, Pam, why did you come over to my side? And you've been working with these people for 6 months. Why did you come over to my side? She said, well, I woke up the other morning and I realized you're the only honest, these are exact words, you're the only honest son of a bitch I've talked to in the last 6 months. That is the truth, folks. The last time I heard from Pam, she told me she was on a hit list. She had to go into hiding. I haven't heard from her since. This was 20-some years ago. So now, by the way, after that, there were several attempts on my life. There were occasions, several occasions, when gunmen were waiting for me at certain locations. I didn't go. I say through divine intervention. I didn't know they were there. But I was able to avoid that. And most recently, because I've become fairly well known, I guess, because I shoot my mouth off and I tell it like it is, I'm the victim of a disinformation program. There are a number of people out there who are spreading disinformation on the internet about me that are absolute lies and false allegations. For example, Stu Webb, who I happen to know is an FBI informant, and I have documentation of this because I took him in once. He said he needed a place to stay for 4 days. I said, well, come on in. He stayed for 7 months. When I asked him to leave, he stole all kinds of products from me. I'll have to say I had all kinds of products that were missing, my research, I had books that were missing and so forth, so he's the only one that could have taken them. And I happen to know that when he left, there was a memo that he had written to the Las Vegas Police Department. In his memo, he stated that he was working with the FBI at that time. I have a copy of that memo. And also he was interviewed on an interview on a videotape, and in the interview, 23 minutes into the tape, he stated that he was also working for the FBI, and he had a symbol number. Symbol numbers are given to informants. They're not given to people walking the streets. Now, I was reviewing this tape on my couch with my roommate after I received it, because I told that he was bad-mouthing me. I was told that. And when I heard him say this, I was shocked. So I set the tape aside, and about a week or 10 days later, I made copies and distributed it to some people around the country. And a man in North Carolina called me and said, there's nothing on there about him working with the FBI and being given a symbol number. So I pulled the tape and played it, and it was not there. Now, the only way that could have not been there is because somebody came in and switched it. Now, there was a period, October the 3rd, when I was out away, and my roommate was gone from my condominium for about 3 hours. Somebody had to come in and put another tape there. You would not know that from playing it, because it was an exact duplicate as far as the cover was concerned. So now we have burglary, we have attempted murder, we have attempts to frame me, and I'm not belly aching or complaining because this goes with the territory. I'm not a whistleblower because I'm not talking about the FBI when I was in. I'm talking about the FBI now that I'm out. What do we have? What do we have since I left? We have agents within the ranks who are spies and been convicted of spying. We had Richard Miller in the FBI Los Angeles division who was working with the Soviets. We had Robert Hansen, Washington, D.C. headquarters agent, who had access to extreme sensitive information. And as a matter of fact, Hansen is reported to have given the promised software to the Soviets. And bin Laden is supposed to have the promised software now, so he can keep track of what we come up with in connection with his investigation by the FBI here locally. And most recently we have James J. Smith, the agent on the West Coast, who was involved with a Katrina Leung, L-E-U-N-G, a Chinese lady, in the ranks. And then in Boston, we had a fellow named John Connolly who was working with the mob, as he had infiltrated the mob, and he had knowledge about contract killings, about involving Whitey Bulger and other individuals. So we have a corrupted FBI now. The FBI, again, selective prosecution by the U.S. Attorney, cover up of major investigations, and they're basically looking the other way. They're being used as puppets, absolute puppets. This is an article here. This is an article here that I have on Mr. Smith, James J. Smith, FBI agent. This is in the Washington Post, and it's dated June 20th, 2003. If you want to take a look at that for documentation. I'm sure you probably read it already in the paper. And here's, again, an article. This is in the Washington Post again, June the 20th, 2003. That was a pretty good issue that day, about the Whitey Bulger and Mr. Connolly of the FBI involved in contract killings. Okay. So where do we go from here, folks? Well, we have a problem. We have a serious problem. By the way, let me mention this. Franklin cover-up documents, the child kidnapping operation out of the Washington, D.C. area and out of Nebraska. Again, backup for the finders. I have a book here by Noreen Gosh. Noreen Gosh's book is Why Johnny Can't Come Home. And this is a story about a 12-year-old newspaper boy, Johnny Gosh, who was kidnapped back in the early 1980s. And Noreen Gosh, the mother, wrote this book. Johnny was kidnapped by this network I'm telling you about, the Finders / FBI Franklin cover-up, and used as a sex toy. He and another boy later stole a car and escaped, and they've been in hiding ever since. They were in hiding on an Indian reservation at one time, and they had to leave because 2020 came out to do a story on this Franklin cover-up case. By the way, it was killed when Disney bought out 2020. But Karen Burns, the producer, I spent 5 days with her, gave her my research and my information. But she went up. She found out where Johnny was hiding and went up there, and he had to leave. So I don't know where Johnny is today, but I understand he's still alive. I hope he stays and is able to continue to live. So what's happened? Well, I have here a report by the, this is in the Washington Times, July 23, 2001, just before 9/11. FBI agent John Roberts, a unit chief for the Bureau's headquarters of professional responsibility, and John Werner, W-R-N-E-R, spent 27 years with the FBI before his retirement in 1999, told a Senate committee last week that they were threatened and intimidated by senior FBI managers during an investigation of the Bureau's role into the fatal shooting at Ruby Ridge. Do you recall that? That was where Vicki Weaver, her 14-year-old son, Samuel, and a deputy U.S. Marshal William Deegan were all killed during the standoff in August 1992. During his testimony, Mr. Roberts told the committee that during the Ruby Ridge inquiry, he and Mr. Werner, also assigned to the probe, were told by senior FBI managers, quote, that we do not work for the FBI, that our assignment to the Ruby Ridge investigation could have an impact on our careers, and that being assigned to the investigation would not be good for us in the end. Well, if they don't work for the FBI, from whom are they receiving their paycheck? They're getting their check from the FBI, the federal government. What I'm telling you is, in my 23 years of experience and research and investigations and lectures and TV appearances, the Illuminati has infiltrated our intelligence community. It's not only infiltrated the intelligence community, it's infiltrated every level of society. It's not just the Illuminati by itself, it's Illuminati-satanic cults. I've talked to a number of Illuminati people, and they were members of a satanic cult, and they were active in satanic cults. The satanic cult problem in this country is serious, and it dovetails across the board with the drugs, pornography, prostitution, and other nefarious activity. In 1773, the Rothschild family commissioned a fellow named Adam Weishaupt to come up with the goals to take over the world. On May the 1st, it's Communist holiday, by the way, of 1776, Adam Weishaupt announced the 25 goals. And these goals were, number 8 was corrupt youth through sex and drugs. I'm not going to go through all of them because that's the subject of another lecture by me. I have a 4-hour lecture on the Illuminati that's available to you folks. The number 8th goal was to corrupt the youth through sex and drugs. Number 12 rule was to elect their own people, elect Illuminati to offices. I'm sure they've done that in Washington. And number 13 was to control the press. Well, on February the 9th, 1917, Congressman Calloway, and I don't have a copy of in front of me, but it will be made available to you on the screen. Congressman Calloway announced that the J.P. Morgan interests had bought up 25 of America's leading newspapers and inserted their own editor in order to control the press. Before they bought up these 25 newspapers, they did a survey of 179 newspapers, and they picked these 25 as the key newspapers where they felt they could be effective. And it has been effective. You're getting information from me today that you won't get from the mainstream media. Fortunately, there are a few press releases now and then that do corroborate what I'm telling you. The 14th goal of the Illuminati I find very interesting because it fits right into Pearl Harbor, Jack Kennedy, Waco, World Trade Center 93, Oklahoma City bombing, the 9/11 attacks. The 14th goal of the Illuminati is to create a crisis and then come in and pretend like you are the savior. And that's what's happened in order to pass the anti-terrorism legislation. The 17th goal promises to politicians, and the